My name is Greg Pacciaroni. I'm a partner with Odgers Berndsen Executive Search, and I've been in the search business for 17 years.
My name's David Cataford. I'm a career specialist at Career Services. I've been doing the job for 9 years.
My name is Behnaz Afsahi. I am a petroleum engineer and I have about 15 years of experience in the industry. I am set up as a consultant right now and looking for opportunities.
Hi, my name is Seth Petrie. I'm a curriculum developer and the owner of Sequoia Coaching. Since graduating, I've done a few different things, and I'm currently on a more specified path and looking for opportunities.
We'll start with Seth.
Sure.
So why don't you tell us about your job search? I mean, how long have you been at it?
Yeah.
And what's your experience been in your job search so far?
Yeah, so I've been looking for work since the beginning of the new year, basically. So I'm pretty fresh at it. I've had one interview so far, and I mean, it hasn't been an awful experience. It was for a job that probably wasn't what I really wanted to do. It was, that initial panic of oh my God, I need to find something, and then it's slow down and say, okay, well, what do I really want to do? What do I really want to target? And so, I mean, it's been interesting getting back into the swing of applying for jobs, period, and then getting ready for the interview process.
Yeah, and you said it had been about 6 years since you applied for a job before. Is that
right? No, it had been about 1.5 years, 2 years. Yeah, it was the summer of 2014 was the last time I moved jobs. And I was there for a little while, and then I quit to start my own business, which is what brought me to interviewing now, looking for.
So I'm curious. You said you've applied for one job since the new year.
Yeah, I've applied for a handful of jobs. I've had one interview.
One interview. Okay.
Yeah.
How did you identify the jobs? I mean, what was your approach?
So the work that I've been doing over the last couple of years has been really related to learning and development, creating e-learning content, and I'm good at it, and I find it fun, and so I decided rather than just kind of firing my email out to anything and everything that I'd be, a fit for, that I'd be super targeted, and so I was looking for things in training, in HR, in sales development, that kind of space, because that tends to be where my design focus lies.
So Behnaz will ask you the same thing. Tell us about your job search. How long you've been at it? What's your experience been?
I have been looking for jobs since September, and it has been an interesting journey. Due to what's happening in the oil and gas market, there are not many opportunities out there, and there's a huge pool of talent, of course, and the number of opportunities are decreasing as a result as well. So I have been looking for any job that has been related to my expertise, and I managed to get one interview during that time period, which I think it went very well, but I didn't get the job.
Okay. So one interview, and that's been about 5 months, it sounds like. Is that
about 4 or 5 months.
Yeah, interesting. How many applications do you think you've sent out?
A handful, probably somewhere in the order of 8, 9, 10, probably.
Yeah. Okay. And posted jobs, or how did you come across the job opportunities?
I try to do a lot of networking and just go and meet with people, as well as looking into websites like LinkedIn or Pro. And I was first focused very much locally, just looking into opportunities available in Calgary. But then I decided to expand it actually to outside Canada, and I realized that it appears there are more opportunities overseas, particularly in the Middle East. However, it takes a lot of time and logistics really to secure one of those opportunities. And I'm pursuing one of those opportunities at the moment, and I'm going to see what's going to happen.
So you've had one interview. What was that like?
It was a very interesting interview. Actually, that was a job that a recruiter approached me, and that was in the very beginning of my search period. And so the recruiter was very interested and set up the interview, and the interview went very long. It was about an hour and a half, and I just felt like everybody was very interested. There were lots of questions and answers going back and forth. There were 3 interviewers in the room, and it sounded like a good opportunity too.
Yeah, that's good. Seth, you said you had one interview.
Yeah.
What was that one like? He laughs.
I laugh because I'm fairly certain. I mean, I fairly certain I got the interview because of someone that I knew. Right? It was a referral, and it was not going to be the right fit. It was sort of it popped up, and they said, "Hey, I hear you're looking for work. I know of an opportunity," and they explained it, and I said, "Oh, I could do that." And so I did the interview, and it wasn't great. Because I mean, it was obvious that it wasn't going to be the right fit, right? I mean, I knew it, the interviewer knew it. Right?
Now, did you learn that in the interview, or did you have a sense of that before you went?
Well, that's a great question, and I think that I kind of knew it wasn't the right thing out of the gate. Like I was like, I'll apply, see if I get an interview, and if I get an interview, I'll go. And
I don't see what it's like during the interview.
Yeah,
and see maybe if it's
yeah,
just a bit.
absolutely, right? Because I mean, when a colleague tells you about a position, you might know. I mean, they might be able to describe it correctly, but maybe they don't even know. So yeah, so that's absolutely why I decided to continue with it, and it was just a bit of a train wreck because it was just like, oh wow, you want me to be? That's what I'd be doing. That's what I'd be spending my time doing. Okay, that's not what I thought, and yeah. So it was not an hour and a half.
Okay.
How long was it?
It was about a half hour.
Because I always tell students that the longer the interview, the better for the interviewee.
Yes,
Because
absolutely.
what would really stress me out is if you said it was a 5-minute interview. It's
Oh.
really hard to find out about somebody in 5 minutes. But if it's an hour and a half, if it's 2 days, that works too.
So I might differ with that on some occasions. Generally, it may be true, but I've run into quite a few situations where, depending on who's doing the interview or who's leading the interview, you've got to really be aware of time. It's probably a good habit to ask how much time they have at the beginning. We've had interviews that were planned for, let's say, an hour. They've gone on to an hour and a half or an hour and 45 minutes because the interviewer couldn't wrap it up. They couldn't control it. They came out of the interview just saying, "Shoot me." This person would not stop talking. So you've got to really be careful. So time is not
That's
always
a
an
good point.
indication. And particularly if it's a first interview, I always, I think what I impress upon people is you're there to get the second interview. So you've got a limited amount of time, be very succinct, to the point, communicate value, and make it to the next round. So both can be good, but I think you've got to sort of judge the situation as they come up.
Absolutely. And one time, I remember I was being interviewed, and he said, "Do you have any questions for us?" But the guy interviewing me looked very stressed out, and I said, "Well, do you have time? Because I have some questions." But it seems like you're really busy. And he said, "Yeah, I'm really busy." And I said, "Well, I can email you the questions."
Yeah, that's a very good approach.
And then left.
So you both made a really good point about the time of the interview, because after that an hour and a half interview, I felt like everything was going really well, and they didn't seem like they're in a rush. But do you think if the interviewee talks too much, is that a mistake? Like explaining things too much, is that a common mistake that maybe some of the interviewees become excited and something that they should avoid, they should do or they shouldn't do?
Well, one thing when I help students prepare for interviews, I want them to be genuine, I want them to be authentic, I want them to be themselves. So if they get nervous and they talk too much when they get nervous, that's not authentic. But if a student's if I do a mock interview with a student and their hands are moving all over the place, that's them, and I don't want them to lose that, but I want them to be aware that that's what they're doing. So it really depends on I want the student to be genuine, and honest.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I think you have to be genuine and honest, but I think you have to balance that with being succinct and answering questions very well. And that, if I was going to kind of rewind that or back that up one step, it probably comes to preparation. You should know about the job you're interviewing for. You should know how your skills relate to it. And you should have practiced and rehearsed the value you can bring to that job. So you got to go in, you got to be genuine, and if you're nervous and you speak a little bit longer, that's fine, but stay on topic, stay on point, and communicate value. And again, the whole goal being you want to come back. You don't have to say everything in the first meeting, but if you're talking too much, that could be a problem. But it's balanced because, some interviewers are going to say, well, David barely spoke, he didn't talk enough, we wanted him to go into more detail. Others will say, he just wouldn't stop.
Yeah.
So, again, you've got to be kind of sensitive to the situation, strike that balance, but stay on point.
So what do you guys see as the biggest mistakes people make?
Well, yeah, I think you have to be honest. You can't make something up in an interview. Because and what I advise students to do is know their strengths, have examples. They're aware of their weaknesses, and they can talk about them. And then they have to have their accomplishment stories set and ready to go and targeted to the job that they're applying for. Because there's lots of behavioral questions, and that's about your past behavior, predicts your future performance. And I want students to almost kind of prepare those stories in advance and go into the interview kind of saying to themselves, I'm going to tell this interviewer these 5 stories somewhere during the interview. But students, and then sometimes you get a behavioral question, and tell me about a time when ABC happened, and that's never happened. Well, I want the student to be honest and say, hey, that's never happened to me, but if it did, this is what I would do. And that's absolutely fine, I think.
Yeah, no, I agree with everything you said. You got to be genuine. Self-awareness is very important. So know your strengths, know your weaknesses. Everybody's gonna ask those. Those are kind of interview 101 questions, so they're gonna come up. So make sure you know how you're gonna respond to them and be honest and aware. I think as far as mistakes, if we go back to that question, what are some of the mistakes? Again, staying on point, staying on topic. I've interviewed people where they have great stories, but they're irrelevant. And they take 10 or 12 minutes, or even if it's smaller, like 3 or 4 minutes. When you're dealing with a 60 minutes or 90 minute time frame, that's a big chunk of your time telling a story that may not be relevant. So the interviewer may leave the interview saying, "Geez, Seth, you're a great guy. I just don't know if you can do the job."
Right.
Because we didn't talk about it. You told a great story about something that happened on the weekend or something, but so stay on point.
And then have those stories career related. I think because I think the hardest question is to tell me about yourself, and I want students to kind of give their career backstory and then why they want this job, and keep it. That's such an open-ended question because it might be what do you do for fun? Because in an interview, I think they want to really see if you fit in with their organization, and they're going to ask you questions to try and find that out. But I want students to focus on career.
Yeah, you're going to hear me say balance a lot, as we kind of go through this discussion, because I think it is balancing professional with the interviewer, the interviewers, getting a sense of who you are as a person. Because culture fit is probably going to be 80% of that success of the job. So you have to fit the team, the organization, so they want to know who you are. But you've got to talk about the job. You've got to know the points. David mentioned, having all these stories of accomplishments, and I agree. You've got to have a whole list of them, whether it's 5, 8, 10 of them. You may not use them all, but you should know them. You should know the value you had, what you did, how you impacted the team, and then you should try and work those into your examples in your conversation. And it should be, I'm going to say rehearsed. You should know them, but you don't want them to come off as rehearsed. It's a conversation you're having with them.
You don't want to come across like a news broadcaster. You want to be authentic.
You got to be exactly.
January
authentic.
2012, I did this.
But if you don't practice,
Yeah.
and if you don't practice, and if you're not prepared with your accomplishments in your mind on the top of your tongue, then you'll lose it in the interview. You'll forget to say it,
Totally.
and you just don't want to be in that situation.
And then practice makes perfect. So I'm always advising people to do mock interviews. There's lots of online interviews you can do. You can practice with family.
Family, friends,
Yeah.
in front of a mirror.
Yeah,
But
in
I
front of a
always-
mirror,
And I
absolutely.
tell people out loud.
Yeah,
Oh,
absolutely.
yeah.
You can run it through in your mind, but until you speak it, you don't know what it sounds like.
Yeah, I tend to either use an app or I have a digital voice recorder. Record yourself, listen to what you just said.
Yeah, it's a great idea.
Bring it back. Yeah.
One of the challenges that interviewees generally face is the balance between underselling and overselling themselves
Yeah.
without coming across braggy or show off. And where is that balance, in your opinion?
Yeah, that's a good one, because I think one of the mistakes people often make is either too much about me or sometimes not enough about me. And so it's exactly about the balance. And I think everybody, this goes back to being prepared with the stories and what you've accomplished. Be proud of your accomplishments, but also recognize the role you played in them, and that there was probably a team surrounding you that either played a role in it or somehow enabled you. If you've probably heard this before, but you hear the STAR technique for answering questions, right? So think of, to give examples, ST in the STAR is situation or task. So what were you supposed to do, or what situation were you in? The A is what action did you take, and then R is the result. So here was the situation I was in, here's what I did, and here's the result. And it's good to talk about what you did, but also talk about the surrounding team and how you fit in.
And then also too, it's also very good to talk about the result. I find when I do mock interviews, people always forget the result. And part of the result too is also the learning, right? Because it maybe the result was a mistake, but what did you learn from that?
Yeah.
But it's very.
And that's a very good point. I think a lot of mistakes can be real wins.
Yeah.
So you shouldn't be afraid of them.
It's about what did you learn, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what did you learn? But back to the question about how much about yourself. Your interview is probably the time that you should talk about your wins. So you should talk about yourself, but just not at the expense of I did it on my own. So you've got to make sure you recognize the team.
Yeah, I've had experience of interviewing an individual that it was a lot about him. It was me, and I just found it a little bit like you mentioned. It doesn't sound like a team player.
And you want to shift it, because I think when you apply for a job, it's not about you. It's about what can you do to make them better, and focus that on, hey, here are some of the things I can do for you. And I think if students can have that, you go a long way.
So I'm going to ask you a question that's not on the script. If you when you get into an interview situation and you can see, like you did that one time, that the interviewer is clearly stressed out and rushed and not really present, right? What would you recommend you do to try to diffuse that situation, or maybe increase the what's the word I'm looking for here? Just the impact that you might have on them. What would you say?
I think it would take a fairly. You'd have to judge the situation.
Sure.
If and for someone more earlier in their career, a little bit more junior individual, they may have more trouble with this than maybe an executive. So you're probably going to find different levels of competence around this. But I think a good one might be if you see somebody is scattered, ask them about it. I think a conversation is always good.
Yeah.
And you can just ask them. You seem distracted. What's distracting you? Are you okay? And if they want to stay on point, so they may or may not tell you.
Sure.
But if they do, you might even be able to relate that back to how does this role fit into that? How is this going to relieve your pressure?
Right.
If it's unrelated, that would be the perfect world where somebody said, you know what, I'm so busy because we can't get our month end closed, and I really need this accountant in here. Well, I'm here to solve that problem. So that's good.
Well, and that happened to me too, because I went for the interview and the guy seemed very stressed, and he was always kind of glancing over at his computer. And I said, "What's wrong? I mean, you seemed distant. You seem like you're more concerned about your computer than me." And he says, "Yeah, I'm having trouble with my Excel spreadsheet." And I said, "Well, I know a little bit about Excel. Maybe I can help you." And he said, "Please do." And when I helped him with this Excel spreadsheet a little bit, I'm not very good at Excel, but I was better than he was, and that calmed him down a little bit.
Yeah. The other, I've worked with clients that's just who they are, and it drives me nuts. It drives people that interview with them nuts. But they'll have, they've got their phone ringing, they've got a PDA or a smartphone on the desk. They're always checking their messages. And that's how they are. I've met some of these people and I've been with them 7 or 8 or 9 times, and that is who they are. And that's how they operate. So sometimes you just have to work through it. You have to respect that they're going to be like that.
Sure.
It may not be ideal, but you've got to learn to work with those individuals as well.
But I guess what I'm hearing is that it's not a terrible idea to be like, "Hey, I noticed you seem a little distracted. How are you today?" To begin an interview, if you notice someone's like,
Well, I think, but if that's within your personality, if that's who you are,
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But if that's not within your personality, then
Yeah.
I want you to be yourself,
Right.
in the interview.
Yeah.
process.
And I've had situations, not only myself when I've gone to meet clients, but when candidates have come into interviews and if they sense something is off or it's rushed, they'll ask, is there a better time? Should we maybe reschedule this? And if you offer that and they say, no, you know what, it's fine, we'll apologize for that, let's just keep going, then I think you've done what you can, you've presented yourself in the best light. I think that awareness though of what's going on around you and that sensitivity to maybe ask, that's what you can do.
Cool. Thank you.
My next question is about the situation that we're facing, especially in the oil and gas industry. A lot of people are losing their job, and one of the questions that I think interviewers like to ask is, why were you laid off?
Mm-hmm.
What's the best way to answer that question so that you don't feel too uncomfortable? Because it is a sensitive sort of a subject. So how best to approach it?
Well, yeah, I mean, that obviously you would have to, I don't want to say something and then everybody does it that way, because it would be very individualized depending on the person that got laid off. But I always, whenever I help students prepare for interviews, I always want them to prepare for what I call the mountain questions. There's always a reason why I should not hire you, or whether it's legit or not. But that, if you've been laid off, go into the interview prepared to answer, you were laid off in your last job, why should we hire you? And have a positive response for that. I wouldn't go on some rant about how you got laid off and how you didn't like your company and your boss and stuff. I would be authentic, tell them the truth, and then tell them the learning, and then tell them why you're being interviewed for this job.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I agree with that. Be prepared for the question. It will come up. And we can even make it worse. Let's say you're fired.
Yeah.
Okay, because today, lots of people have been laid off. So I think in that situation, first of all, it's easy to hide behind that. Because you say, you know what, I was let go with 150 people. I think the hurdle you have to overcome in that situation is most people are thinking, not many companies lay off the top performers, so why were you in that group? Some do, but generally they're looking at the people, either the teams that don't fit or the performers that are weaker. So you have to address that, kind of why you were let go. And honesty is the best policy. And if you don't know why, well, laid off is easier, but let's say you were fired. I think you have to own up to why you were fired. Personality conflict, if you don't know why and you were terminated without cause, I always tell people, take a guess, because you probably know. And if you were to take one guess, why do you think they would let you go? They say, well, it might have been this, it might have been my boss, or whatever it is. Okay, well then tell me the story about that. It's very important, though, I think, to get past being the victim to looking forward in your path. So whether you were laid off, whether you were terminated, you've got to get over that very quickly, because I've seen it taint interviews where you get hung up on it. You spend 8 minutes, 9 minutes of your 60 minutes talking about the situation in the layoff, when you really just need to own up to it and move on. And same with a termination, own up to it and move on. They're going to find out. Almost every interview process has references. References are typically your supervisors or teammates that can comment on your work. So they're going to find out. So the best defense is a good offense. Tell them, so that when they call someone and hear it, they've heard it from you first.
And that's a mountain question, right? Like I think also too, maybe at one point in my career, I had 7 jobs in 7 years. Well, that's a bit of a red flag. And I went into every interview prepared to answer that question. David, why should we hire you? You've had 7 jobs in 7 years. You're going to leave us in a year. And I had an answer for them. I never got that question though going into the interview, which is crazy, because they should have asked me that, but they never did.
Interesting.
But and then also too, I think in an interview, be prepared for anything, right? Like you prepare with your stories and all that sort of stuff. But maybe they ask you bizarre questions.
I've had some weird ones.
So what's the
Give us an
strangest-
example.
Yeah.
Give us an example, right?
The strangest question you ever got.
Probably the first one that comes to mind that like really threw me off was I had an interviewer and they said, okay, well, why do you want to work here? And I was talking about the fit with the company. This is my first like big job after graduating, right? I'd been in internships and kind of fiddly little things up until that point. And I said, I love the values of the company and this and that and the next thing. And then they just got really aggressive and like drove home, well, how do your values fit? What do you mean? what values? Like they really dug into it, and it was fine because I was prepared for it because I knew that I wanted to work at this company. I knew why I wanted to work at this company more than just they look like fun, right? Or it's a neat office, or whatever, right? It was I knew, but it was just the aggression behind the like, well, why? No, really,
Yeah.
you say. So what about your life fits with us? Whoa. So that was interesting. And then I had someone ask me how I organized my sock drawer.
Sounds like a Google type question.
Right?
You know,
That's crazy.
Yeah. How do you organize your sock drawer? Really well, actually.
Yeah, interesting. You know, I mean, we're involved in a lot of interviews, and I'm pretty straightforward. Most of the clients that I've worked with, there have been hundreds. I don't even know how many over the years, but most of the questions have been pretty straightforward. So I think it's an anomaly. I think it's unusual when you get one of these off the wall questions, and I think interviewers are, for the most part, starting to go away from that kind
Which
of
is good.
bizarre, because there was a trend for a while, because Google was doing it, all these Silicon Valley companies were having these crazy questions, people started trying it, and I think they quickly found out they don't help. So thankfully, I think people are moving on past that. But
When I won an employer, they said, they asked how many couches are there currently in Canada. That was an interview question. And I advise students to answer these questions seriously. Because they're trying, I think when they ask that question, they're trying to see how you problem solve,
yeah,
how you think. I think is why they ask those questions. But I'm glad they're getting away from those.
yeah, and it's, I would probably talk about use it as a problem solving question, and if not with an answer, the way you approach the problem. But yeah, I think most people don't do that. Most interviewers don't do that. But you write them down because they're good stories.
Yeah, right. A sock drawer? Okay.
I'd never heard that before. One of the situations actually that was kind of very strange to me, the interviewer asked me about the subject I had done research, my master's thesis research about. So he kept asking me questions, and I got really, it's something that I was very attached to, and I was very excited to talk about it. And then after a few minutes he asked, so if you want to do this process, would you like to do that? Would you suggest it? And I'm like, of course, like in this situation and in this reservoir, we'll do that. And then he started just counter-arguing me. Why we should do that actually? Would you just push for that process? And then I just realized, okay, this is a trap. I'm like, well, of course I have to look at the whole situation and just realize what's best for the company. It's just not what is the best process that I'm very attached to or interested in that time.
Yeah.
So that was interesting. I caught myself getting too emotional, and I realized that was a trap. It's pushing me towards.
And he may not have intended to trap you.
Okay.
I mean, it's possible, but I've learned, and a lot of the feedback I've received is many people are not very skilled interviewers, particularly if they're technical or their professional backgrounds, unless they are actually interviewing as their job. So they go in with a bit of a framework, and they ask questions that they find interesting, and then they end up going down a rabbit hole themselves that they never planned. So be ready for that. Sometimes they don't intend to do that. They don't always follow a plan. I had an example. I had a client that I worked with several years back that we gave him an interview framework, kind of a guide to follow, and he said, no, I've done lots of interviews, and don't worry, I'm pretty good with these. Spent almost 90 minutes with each candidate. Candidates, when we debriefed with them and said, how did it go? Candidates did not speak. The interviewer, spent almost 90 minutes talking about the company and the job. The odd thing is he had chosen a candidate he likes at the end of it, which is baffling to me. But again, just from an interviewing skill perspective, he didn't have it. So I always say if it's not a trained interviewer, be ready that they're probably feeling it out as they go as well.
You might be right, because that person was a technical person,
Yeah.
so maybe didn't have the right skill sets for the interview, and it made me feel really uncomfortable. I'm like, I was speaking about the thing I think it's right, but then it contradicted me. And I'm like, oh, okay.
They probably saw it as a very fascinating science problem.
Might have been.
So not like recently, but before when I first convocated, I went through a couple interview processes that were extremely lengthy, two that were 4 rounds, both of them. And so a question that's come up for me is, if you find yourself in a situation like that where you're coming in for a 4th interview, how do you make it sound fresh again? Like how do you say, yeah, hey, it's like you've never met me before, even though you've asked me these questions, 3 times already.
And these were the same panel or the same group of interviewers? Or?
There were a handful of people that were the same in all of them, yeah.
And were they the same type of questions in each of the 4 interviews?
Pretty similar, right? One of them was with a consulting firm, and so the last couple were a little bit more involved because they were actually dealing with, problem solving and like providing. It was like a case interview, basically. But the other one was with a bank, and it seemed really similar. It seemed like the same questions.
Well, I think in that situation, I would just recognize that you're answering for the benefit of those people that haven't heard your answer already. The ones that interviewed you in round 1, 2, or 3, or however many there were, probably said, look, Seth's a good guy, we like him, we want you to meet him. And then, how many interview questions are there? I mean, there's 100, but there's probably, a dozen or so core questions. So they're going to run through them, but it's for the benefit of the people that haven't heard your answer. So I think it's fine to acknowledge that, hey,
And
David, you've heard this before, but, here's what I did.
And then also too, I think they want a good interviewer will kind of check back to see if you're consistent. So
Right.
maybe that's what they were doing too, to see if your stories in your 4th interview match with your 1st interview, because that's consistency.
Right.
And then,
Yeah,
that
good
might
point.
have been it
I've
too.
had that experience.
Well, they'll ask like, what is your weakness or what are skills you're working on at the beginning of the interview, and then they might ask you the same question towards the end of the interview to see if it's similar, because if it's not, then you're not authentic in that.
Or you have a lot of things you're working on.
Yeah, or
When we started off, we talked about common interview mistakes, and I think presentation, and in presentation, I'd probably lump a bunch of things, but I'd say be really aware of kind of how you present yourself when you go to an interview. And it seems like table stakes. Everybody knows that you should. We had this discussion when we met today. You dress for the job, right? Dress one step up, because you don't want to be the worst dressed in the room when you're the candidate. If you don't know the dress code, err on the side of more formal. But paying attention to posture, body language, tone of voice, lots of research on voice. 80% of communication is done through tone. Only 20% is actually what you say. So it's not what you say, it's how you say it. So be aware of all those kind of subtle things when you're in an interview setting, because you've got, and again, you might be a little bit on edge, a little bit nervy, which is okay. I think nerves can help in an interview setting.
Absolutely,
As long as
I
it
totally
doesn't,
agree with that.
as long as it doesn't cripple you. And it's okay to admit you're nervous. I think it's fair to say, look, I haven't interviewed in 6 years or 15 years, so I'm a little bit nervous here. That's good, right?
Well, and that's the thing. I always relate interviewing. This is kind of bizarre, but I relate interviewing to boxing, and Muhammad Ali is my hero. And Muhammad Ali would prepare for his boxing matches, right? So with the preparation, you prepare your stories, what you're going to say about yourself. But then you also have to be prepared for the unexpected, right? During the interview, which I think is Muhammad Ali would, he would practice all his combinations during the boxing match, but he would have to go in between rounds and try and think how he can beat this guy.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. No amount of preparation is enough. I mean,
No.
you go in knowing your stuff.
Yeah.
And you should be a subject matter expert on yourself. So if you can't answer a question on yourself, probably haven't prepared.
So on that, how many hours should you prepare for 1 hour interview? Is there such a rule of thumb?
I've never heard a rule of thumb, but I would say as much until you feel you're comfortable.
Okay.
And like David was saying, just try and anticipate all the questions and be ready for the ones that you can't even anticipate. So if you think you need to answer a dozen questions, you probably should be prepared for 25 or 30. And because there will be some that you can't predict.
And the thing is too, you're going to prepare your stories in advance. You're going to get a question, and you're going to think one of your stories that you prepared doesn't answer that question. I want people to answer the question. You're going to have to think on the fly. But because you've prepared them in advance, you'll be better at thinking about them on the fly.
Yeah. Or you'll relate it to
Yeah,
something
or
that's
you
relevant.
can always go back to this story. Like you can tell a story about when you worked for some guy or whatever, and then you came up with this innovative idea, and then they ask you another question about a conflict, you can go back to that story and say, well, my coworker was angry at me when I did this and this, and you can go back to the similar stories during the interview. I think that's absolutely fun too.
Do you guys notice any sort of trends emerging in what interviewers are looking for?
Do you want to answer that first?
I mean, it would be the same thing. I would think. They want to know, one, can you do the job? Two, how will you do the job? And then three, will you fit in? I think that's the basic core of an interview, right? Am I wrong? I mean, trends are doing more kind of Skype and interview and
Yeah, I think
computer
for a while, I think of a trend, the big one that, maybe 10, 15 years ago would have been behavioral interviews. And I think there's always behavioral questions worked into the interview now, but it's not, they're not trying to be, psychoanalysts in the interview anymore. And I think that they would ask you questions that would seem irrelevant and they would try and extract some meaning out of it. I think that's almost past. Now the behavioral questions that we're seeing tend to be more related to the job or to the environment or how you're going to fit the team, the culture. And I think that's a good thing. As far as trends, yeah, I agree.
a lot of scenario questions.
I think it comes back to people want you to demonstrate the work you've done and the value you've added, and then at the same time demonstrate how you're going to fit the team or the organization. And that's usually through evidence by what you've done in the past. So.
And then sometimes at the end, a good interviewer at the end of the interview will say, well, is there anything else you can tell us about you? And then, it's always good to give them a story that you haven't told. And it's always good to have questions for them at the end of the interview. I think that is key.
Yeah, that's a really important one. We had a situation only a few weeks ago. Senior job, individual went in and went through a series of 2 or 3 interviews, but really left a bit of a negative tone at the end because he had no questions at the end. This is someone who's going to lead an organization. I think go with questions. They can be high level, they can be strategy oriented, they can be even as it relates to competition, whatever it is, but have a question or two.
Mm-hmm.
So we've talked about all of this, I think, through the course of this discussion, but what I would say, advice is, first of all, be prepared. So do your research, practice, so know yourself, know what value you bring, and I think, listen to the questions that are being asked and make sure you stay on topic and stay to the point, but building your personality into that as well. So you can't be a robot firing answers back. You want to show your personality, but just, listen to the question, stay on point.
There was a lot for me to learn from what we talked about here, and from what I've learned also from previous interviews. I think try to advertise your brand and sell yourself. Like you said, you have that 60 minutes or whatever amount of time that are given to sell yourself and to show them that you can do the job and you're the right person. And the other point that you made, which is a good take on for me, is be honest and answer the questions just by honesty and be true to yourself.
I think one of the things that stood out to me the most, like when I was first interviewing after graduating, that I've carried forward, is not being concerned about leaving a little bit of silence every now and then.
Yeah, silence is good.
Yeah, to take a second, if someone asks you a question, to say, okay, well, let me tell you about that, right? Because it allows you, at least for me, in a situation like that, it allows me to calm any nerve that maybe pops up when they ask a question. And then I can make sure it's like, right, I'm telling that story, and that's why I'm telling that story, right? To get back to what you were saying about the reason that you should be here, right? What's the value? What's the value in the story I'm telling? Take a second, think about it, then go forward.
And I think employers like that because then they can see you think, and that's real, right? So if you get stumped in an interview, that's fine. Think of an answer, and then give them a nice, honest, genuine answer. I also think that a very important thing that hasn't been mentioned is at the end of the interview, know the next step. And if they don't tell you, I think it's fine to ask. And I remember one time I asked, well, well, what's the next step in the process? And they shot me down right there and they said, David, we just don't think you have the skills and we don't think you'll fit in and we're not going to proceed further with you. And I was really mad. But then on the drive home, I was thinking, well, now I know I don't stand a chance for that job, and that's okay. I got dumped, and that's okay. But I think it would have been worse if I didn't ask that question, and then I would have thought, hey, I have that job opportunity when I did. So I think always knowing the next step if they don't tell you. And then I think sending a nice, genuine thank you note or thank you card, but make it authentic. Like, just, hey, thanks for interviewing me. Like, really write a nice personalized message. If you can, drop a card off.
I'll build a little bit on that because you're right. I think you should know the next step. I think it's fair to ask about communication as well. So when should I follow up, or who should I follow up with? And I think the thank you note is critical, whether they're handwritten or email. I think both are acceptable today. And I also I encourage everybody, if you send a thank you note, don't prompt a response. And because you don't want to corner somebody into an obligation that they don't really want to fulfill, but just a genuine thank you note. It's a great experience. Whatever, make it short and sweet, succinct, and follow that.
Short enough that they could read it on their phone if it just pops up. They don't have to
Yeah, it's probably safe to say that people are using their smartphones for almost everything. So if you have too many words, I'm the worst for it. So I use myself as an example. I don't read much. So if you go on too long, you've lost me.
Yeah, 3 sentences. Done.
Yeah, exactly.
There are lots of resources out there. There are lots of books, YouTube videos, and workshops on how to do interviews. So, in your opinion, what are the best resources to go through before an interview? Which one are most valuable?
Yeah, so there's no book that comes to mind for me right now. I find in the past, I've read a lot, through my career on kind of everything from job searching techniques to resumes, and I think there's a lot of good ones. So you can probably use any of them because they seem to overlap. I think the internet now has really good points, and there's lots of experts that are publishing blogs about job searching. There's been very few that I disagree with, although there might be some. So I think you can find almost everything you need somewhere on the internet. I think practice matters, and I would say that every interview you get, take it seriously. And if you don't get the job, it's still a great opportunity to build your brand, learn about the company, to get some interview experience, and figure out, do a postmortem on every interview. What did I do well? What could I have done differently? What wasn't I prepared for? And take that forward into your next one. But yes.
Thank you.
And then, I work at University of Calgary Career Services. I think the resources that we've built up on our webpage are fantastic. And I'm kind of doing a good plug for career services, but we have an online interview prep workshop. It's very general though, so because it's for all students. But I think that's kind of a good starting point as well. But then again, practice makes perfect.
If I had to recommend anyone, it would have been career services.
Okay.
No bias, right?